I'm Michael Stanley, Vice President of the John A. Widtsoe Foundation and LDS Institute Director here at the University of Southern California. And again, it's my honor to welcome you to this particular session. The title of the session is The Physical Creation of Sacred Spaces and Sacred Clothing. Our speakers this morning will be Gary Rensburg from Rutgers University, Daniel Gertner from Southern Baptist Seminary, and Janet Ewell, an independent scholar. Reverend Jim Burklow, the Associate Dean of Religious Life at the University of Southern California, will respond to the presentations, after which we will have a 15-minute panel discussion led by our moderator, Margaret Barker, who also served as our keynote speaker yesterday at the beginning of this conference. This will be followed by a 10-minute question-answer session. There will be question cards that will be provided to you. Please feel free to write on those question cards, and we'll submit those again to our moderator. Without further ado, again, I turn the time over to our panel.
Good morning, everyone. And let me, again, appropriate to begin this panel with thanking the organizers. It's just a pleasure to be here at USC, and everything has gone so smoothly, and learning so much from so many interesting papers by learned colleagues. I'm going to be speaking about sacred space in Judaism after the temple, that is, from the destruction of the temple in the year 70 CE onward. Now, the best evidence we have, because we have the most evidence, and it's in words as opposed to arts and architecture, which we'll get to later on, comes from the best-known post-temple Jewish movement, which is to say the rabbinic movement. The earliest rabbinic text comes from the year 200 CE, the Mishnah. Margaret Barker already mentioned it, I think, twice yesterday, both in the morning and in the evening. It is a guidebook of Jewish law, perhaps a codification of Jewish law, depending on how one defines these terms, which includes majority and minority opinions of various rabbis dealing with ritual, law, custom, you name it. Your handout gives you the outline of the Mishnah, how it is structured. It was compiled by Rabbi Judah Hanassi, again around the year 200 CE. 6 orders divided into any number of tractates for a total of 63 tractates. And the orders, as you can see here, I've given you their Hebrew names in the left column, but their English equivalents: agricultural laws, festivals and sacred times, women on the first side, and you go to the second side, torts, sacrifices, and purities. Now, the interesting thing about the Mishnah is that it is compiled at a distance of 130 years, perhaps 4 generations or so after the destruction of the temple, and yet it includes so much information about the temple. At least 1/3 of the Mishnah is clearly related to temple ritual, which is to say the 5th and 6th orders, the last third, 2 of the 6 orders, the last third of the Mishnah, Kodashim, related to sacrifices, and Toharot, all about the purity laws. Now, the sacrifices hadn't been performed, as I said, in 130 years, and the purity laws fell by the wayside without any temple by which these issues simply did not become relevant once more. And the final act, Roy again alluded to this in his comments at the end, the final act would require some sort of sacrifice to totally remove your impurity, the exception being menstrual impurity, which is the 7th tractate in the order of purities, which remains an issue, not only then, but down to the present day in Judaism. So it's remarkable that so much of the Mishnah is devoted to temple matters. Furthermore, it's not just in those 2 orders of the Mishnah, but in all sorts of other tractates, starting already in the first, going between the first and the second orders in particular, but also some items in the 3rd order dealing with women. This is just a handful, or more than a handful, of tractates which evoke temple ritual. So, for example, the tractate Pesachim, Passover in Hebrew, it describes the Passover ritual not only as it is in the year 200 CE at a distance of the temple, but the way it was observed in the temple. Similarly, Yoma, the tractate dealing with the Yom Kippur or Day of Atonement ritual, describes in great detail the Day of Atonement ritual as it existed in the temple. And I just keep reiterating to you, this has not been in existence in the year 200 for 130 years. And this raises the question, accordingly, why is so much of the Mishnah, what was in the agenda, what was the program of Rabbi Judah in compiling the Mishnah to include so much information about an entity and an edifice and a structure that no longer existed in Judaism? First of all, 3 bullet points here, none of them mutually exclusive. Right? We have various options here. 1, the need to retain the traditions for when the temple is to be rebuilt. Jewish history and Jewish experience had told the people in post-destruction Judaism that, in fact, the temple had once before been destroyed by the hands of the Babylonians in 586 BCE and was rebuilt after the decree of Cyrus the great Persian emperor, and dedicated in 516 BCE, 70 years after it was destroyed, inaugurating the Second Temple period. So here are Jews in the second, on the cusp of the second now into the 3rd century CE, at a distance of X number of years since the destruction of the temple, and Jewish history had taught them that it could be expected to be rebuilt. Now, more time had passed than the historical rebuilding after the destruction of the first temple, but that would be one reason why the Mishnah had to include all of this information. Secondly, and we don't know, of course, what was the expectation of the rebuilding of the temple. I'll get to that in just a moment. Secondly, the memory of the temple itself, just the memory of it, serves to replace the actual rituals, right? One cannot go and do the Day of Atonement ritual, the basics of which are in Leviticus 16 and then expanded upon in the tractate of Yoma, the 5th tractate in the order of Moed. One cannot go and do the old temple rituals for whatever it might be, based on the previous image that you saw. But the memory of it it becomes its own ritual act, right? The recording of it and the memory of it and the recitation of it becomes its own ritual act in replacement of the actual rituals that were no longer possible with the temple lying in ruins. Similarly, the 3rd bullet point here, the study of these laws, right? The various studies of these laws becomes a ritual act in itself. There's some overlap here, of course, between the 2nd and 3rd bullets. And this becomes part, certainly, of later Jewish tradition as Jewish scholars beyond the early classical rabbinic period continue to study temple rituals built based on the Mishnah, including, most famously, the great medieval sage, the greatest sage in the history of Judaism, Maimonides, who lived in 12th century Cairo. Just as an aside, by the way, when we toss around these texts, let me always remind you that these texts are in our hands because of the remarkable work of medieval scribes who transmitted them to us, whether they be in Hebrew or Aramaic or Greek or Latin or whatever it might be. And here we have the best example of the Mishnah. This is my sidebar and plug for the digital humanities world. There are 3 complete manuscripts of the Mishnah from the Middle Ages. The most reliable is in Budapest. Our colleagues in Budapest have put the entire document up on the web at a dedicated website with the most exquisite images, as you can see here. You can capture them as JPEGs and then use them for class and presentations such as this. 2 other complete manuscripts. The Parma manuscript, we call them after usually where they're located, Parma, Italy, at the Biblioteca Palatina, and the Cambridge manuscript in the Cambridge University Library. There are incomplete Mishnah manuscripts as well, including hundreds of them from the Cairo Geniza collection, medieval cache of documents found in an old synagogue in Cairo at the end of the 19th century, and other manuscripts which just have survived down to the present day. And without doing too much self-promotion, that's not my intent here, but to show you the one on the right, housed at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, incomplete manuscript, but a huge chunk of it, as you can see, remains, which found its way from Damascus, where it was located in the 19th century, down to the JTS library. And the website there is my own website that I created. This is the Rutgers University Humanities Project at work. Scholars no longer have to travel to New York to actually see this manuscript, which has never been published until the digital age. So thank you, Internet. For those of you who've never understood or never been exposed to the Mishnah, just to give you a sense of its size, the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, has about 300,000 words, and the Mishnah is less than 2/3 of that, right? So maybe 60 to 65% of the size of the Bible. If I had a book here of a complete Mishnah in Hebrew or English translation, you'd be able to imagine that. My handout, by the way, also shows you in the two right-hand columns whether there is a Talmudic commentary on the Mishnah for every particular tractate. The Talmud of the Land of Israel, which was completed at a slightly earlier time in the 5th century, is about 1 million words, and the Talmud of Babylonia, completed in the 6th century, a little bit later, is about 2.5 million words. And just to give you a sense of another corpus, except it's not comparable, the New Testament, of course, is much smaller, and that's counting words in Greek. And if it were translated back into Hebrew, Hebrew uses far fewer words to say the same thing. But you get a sense, from your own knowledge, of the size of the New Testament vis-a-vis the Jewish Bible. But you get a sense here of how large the Mishnah is. So that is, back to the subject at hand, that is one statement, right? The Mishnah represents one statement of post-biblical Judaism, the one for which we have the most documentation because, as I've just shown you, it is approaching 190,000 words. It evokes the temple in so many diverse ways, as I've just explained to you. Interestingly, there are only 3 explicit statements about the rebuilding of the temple anywhere within the entire Mishnah. So it describes all these rituals, but only 3 times does it actually refer to the rebuilding of the temple. And that is because, to my mind, the rabbinic program led by Rabbi Judah and his successors, his predecessors and his successors, not his predecessors so much, certainly him and his colleagues and his successors, is a very non-eschatological document, a non-eschatological program underlying this text. It is certainly moving away from any apocalyptic notions, and that would be in the wake of A, probably the emerging religion of Christianity, and B, the disastrous Bar Kokhba revolt, which had apocalyptic elements to it, which took place in the 130s CE, quashed by the Romans. We now move to the synagogue. The synagogue origins are actually in the 3rd century BCE. Many people are under the misconception that this temple was destroyed on such and such a date in the year 70 CE, and the next day the Jews built the first synagogue, and voila, the whole transition from temple to synagogue took place. That is incorrect. The synagogue starts in the diaspora. This is the earliest notation of it, from a dedication stone in 3rd century BCE Egypt. It is not called synagogue yet. The Greek word here is prosuche, which means prayer or prayer house. But it shows us that in the diaspora community, the Jews of Ptolemaic Egypt were creating synagogues for all sorts of ritual acts, including prayer at a distance of the temple to which they could not reach and sacrifice. They sent fiscal contributions to the temple. We know that from Philo and others. But they had their own prayer services happening in places known as the prosuche, eventually shifting in terminology to the synagogue. By the way, we don't have them. We have about 10 or 12 of these dedication stones. They're all in secondary use. We have no evidence of what these synagogues look like when these synagogues were abandoned or whatever. Secondary use archaeologically means someone takes the stones and puts them in a new wall for some new structure. And that's where we have these. But we learned quite a bit, of course, about the nature of the synagogue from such a text such as this. And, of course, note that it is invoking the name of the King Ptolemy II and his queen. Synagogues exist elsewhere in the diaspora, including in Ostia near Rome. These are the ruins of that synagogue. I'm going to have to go through these a little bit quickly because of the time constraints here. And on the capitol, above the capitol of that synagogue, you'll see it in just a moment where it's located. There are 2 of them. You can see, as you could look up, you could see on the ceiling the depiction of the menorah, the 7-branch candelabrum, which stood in the temple. And now the art piece has been transformed to the synagogue, and you can see the 2 columns with their capitals and the menorah on either one, high up above the bima, which is the elevated platform in the synagogue where the reader would conduct the prayers and read the Torah and so on. At Sardis in western Turkey, the outer court of the synagogue there, I have actually never been able to get a photo of the actual menorah, but this is a standing menorah that stood in the courtyard of that synagogue. So it's showing you the accoutrements of the temple are being transferred into the art and architecture of the synagogue. That's the main point that I'm trying to demonstrate for you here. The inscription along the top is broken. It's very fragmentary, but fortunately we can at least read the first word, which tells us that a Jew named Socrates was the one who dedicated this menorah to the Sardis synagogue during the early Byzantine period. Interestingly, by the way, Socrates wasn't even such a well-known name, well-used name amongst Greeks, and yet a Jew took it on, or his parents gave him that name, probably an homage to the great philosopher, just to show you the symbiosis between Greek and Jewish culture that existed at this time. To the east, in Dura Europos, in modern-day eastern Syria on the Euphrates River, there are frescoes decorating the entire room. I've never been there. It's obviously very unsafe today. The synagogue is housed now in the Damascus Museum in a safe room, and we hope, with bits and pieces also at Yale, at the Yale University Museum. And you can see that on these frescoes they have imagery of the temple as well on these synagogue walls. And here you see another depiction of the menorah. And above the niche for the Torah, yet another depiction of the menorah and presumably temple facade. Also in this one, temple facade. We'll come back to that in a little bit. And in this place, this right here. If we move to the land of Israel, I've just given you a quick tour of the diaspora, right? Egypt, for which we have no real art. Ostia near Rome, Sardis in Anatolia, and Dura to on the Euphrates River. If we now come to the land of Israel, we see the same phenomenon. We have lots of synagogues from the Byzantine period, 4th through 7th centuries. This is the synagogue of Sepphoris, the place where Rabbi Judah actually redacted the Mishnah. It was a leading rabbinic center in the Galilee of northern Israel, not far from Nazareth. Actually, if you stand on Sepphoris today, you can see the skyline of Nephoris, skyline being, well, make it sound like it's New York. You can see the buildings of Nazareth over the next hill. This is the synagogue when it was just being excavated. After it was all cleaned up, it's amazing what these restorers are able to do for us. The synagogue floor is a mosaic floor, right? So you see different kinds of synagogue art here, right? You're seeing columns, and you're seeing a menorah in 3D, right? You can see wall frescoes at Dura. Here you see a mosaic floor. And on the mosaic floor of the synagogue, you have a variety of items that came right out of the temple and the temple ritual. So on the far left there, the 2 trumpets, and they're labeled with the Hebrew word, telling you what they are. To the right of that, a basket of grain, because of the grain offering, the fine grain semolina offering to the temple. The large structure here to the right being the table with the showbread on it. So these are all temple objects, right? But they're being brought into the synagogue as a memory of the temple, now at a distance of obviously more centuries than the Mishnah. The Tiberias synagogue, the place where the Talmud of the Land of Israel was produced. And also at the front of that synagogue, you have 2 menorot, candelabras right out of the temple, along with other objects which came out of temple ritual, which have been transferred to the synagogue. I'll tell you that in just a moment, not just in art, but in reality. On either side, you can see the ram's horn, the shofar. The tall, thin item is the lulav, the palm branch. These are all rituals that once upon a time existed in the temple, and which will be in the which are transferred to the synagogue at this point in ritual and in art. Beit Alpha, another synagogue in the Galilee, in the lower Galilee. Again, the upper register of the mosaic floor shows you again 2 menorot installed there, lulav, shofar. Everybody jokes they look more like cats, but yes, they're supposed to be lions. Okay. And the ark, and hanging from the ark on the top in the middle of that triangle, you can see the eternal lamp. Right. Again, this all goes back to temple material and earlier, as Roy described earlier today, tabernacle accoutrements. So these rituals that we know of from the temple are moved to the synagogue in the developing ritual life and liturgical life of Jews in a post-temple world. The priestly blessing, Margaret mentioned that last night, the blowing of the shofar, the waving of the palm branch, the lulav, the recitation of Hallel, a series of psalms which were recited in the temple on festival days, happens in the synagogue liturgy, recitation of daily psalms, the perpetual lamp. All of this becomes part of the synagogue as it's transferred from the temple over the course of centuries in the developing world of post-temple Judaism. Back to the Mishnah for just one moment. The opening words of the Mishnah, Brachot, chapter 1, Mishnah number 1, asks at what time does one say the evening prayer? How dark does it have to be before you can actually recite the evening prayer? And the answer is from the time when the priests enter, or perhaps we should say would enter, the temple to eat their terumah offering. That doesn't help us at all, right? Nobody today would certainly know at what time did the priests enter the temple to eat this particular offering in the late afternoon, early evening as the sun was setting. But obviously that was a marker in some way for Rabbi Judah and for his colleagues to determine when the evening prayer could be recited. That gives you a very fine point of Mishnaic law based on temple ritual, or post-temple Judaism within the rabbinic system based on temple ritual. Doesn't help us out a lot. Both Talmudim try to explicate it, but they're even at a further distance to try to determine exactly when that is. Is it pitch black? No. Is it the sun still? Is it behind the horizon? Et cetera, et cetera. But you get the main point. Lane Richmeyer, a Dutch architect, has done these wonderful reconstructions of what the temple looked like after Herod's great expansion project. Looking at the southern wall here on the right, I want to focus on these three gates that you see here, indicated here in another entrance to the temple, people going up and down the stairs. And if you go back to the door of fresco, notice, by the way, that the middle gate on the right there is larger than the other two. The door of fresco shows that at a distance of perhaps 100 or 200 years after the destruction of the temple, closer to 200 years probably. And up close, a different representation of the triple gates, right, on the synagogue walls. The Bar Am synagogue in the far north of Israel, right on the Lebanese border, the modern-day political border. Notice the three entranceways into the temple, into the synagogue through the facade, evoking the three gates of the temple, with the central one being larger than the two which flank it. At the necropolis of Beit Sha'arim, where many of the famous rabbis, including Rabbi Judah himself, were buried, in the lower Galilee, the necropolis is entered in a series of caves that you go into to see these various tombs, thousands of tombs there, a series of caves. This is the main cave. The same imagery as existed in the temple. The 24 priestly courses which are described in 1 Chronicles 24, for each particular week or 2 weeks, it's not clear, a different group of priests was responsible for the temple rituals. And yes, that I realize only gives you 48 weeks, not if it's every 2 weeks, or 24 weeks if it's every 1 week. But that way they would be able to rotate in some fashion. Everybody would get a chance at Passover at some point. Everybody would get a chance at Yom Kippur and so on. So it's probably for that reason that we have 24 courses described in 1 Chronicles 24. And on the synagogue floor of Caesarea, right on the Mediterranean coast, from about the 5th century CE, three fragments of a gray marble slab were found, which, when reconstructed, give you, in fact, the 24 priestly courses. We only have 3 of the fragments, and I only have photos of 2 of them, but it gives you a sense of what the text looked like. And it says course, or guarding, or watch, like the first watch, the second watch, etc., all the way down to the 24th watch with somebody's name, bringing out the material from 1 Chronicles 24. And in far-away Yemen, you can't get further away in the Jewish diaspora than Yemen at the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. From around this same time period, we have a Hebrew inscription from Beit Hagdir, 15 kilometers east of Sana'a. Our hearts go out to the great suffering of the people of Yemen right now with the civil war that's happening there. And here you also have the 24 priestly courses in a list, including 9 of the names which appear in 1 Chronicles 24. Mishnah, rituals, memory, synagogue art and architecture, the necropolis, the priestly courses. In all these ways, Judaism kept track of the temple in a post-temple culture. My coda is the Magdala synagogue, just excavated recently in northern Israel on the shores of Lake Tiberias, the Sea of Galilee, from the 1st century. Everything I just said is at a distance to the temple. But we may have to rethink some of what I've said. It's either at a distance chronologically, or in the case of Ostia in the far west near Rome, geographically. But here's Magdala in Israel itself, while the temple still stood. And this remarkable stone was found there. This altar, I don't want to call it an altar table. Nobody knows what it is. We're just calling it the Magdala stone. Let's not bias the case and talk about it as a table or anything like that. Menorah, depicted here, up close with 2 jugs. and on the side what appeared to be grain offerings and a jug of oil or wine, evoking the images that were brought, evoking the products which were brought to the temple for sacrifices. Thank you.
My task is to address something in between what we have just heard with respect to sacred space in Judaism after the temple into rabbinic era, and what we've heard earlier from Roy Gain about the Israelite sanctuary. So my task is to focus on sanctity or sacred space in Jewish and early Christian tradition during the Second Temple Jewish period, in Second Temple Judaism, which we could say is broadly from about Alexander the Great, 323 BCE, to 135 CE, Bar Kokhba, and into early Christianity. And I'll also discuss some traditions that stem beyond that time. But I'm going to look specifically at one facet of sacred space, and that is the veil of the temple. We've talked about how the division of sacred space works in Israelite cultic worship, and I'm going to pick up on some of that and see how those traditions are appropriated in subsequent Judaism as well as in early Christianity. So to begin with the veil of the temple in Israelite cultic worship in the Hebrew Bible, the veil of the temple is the innermost barrier separating the holy place from the most holy place in the tabernacle and subsequent temple of the Hebrew Bible. In the earliest text, stemming from Exodus, it is said to be violet in color or light purple and made with crimson thread, often thought to signify royal attire. Now, Margaret Barker has herself done considerable amount of work on the significance of this, and I refer you to her excellent work, which I've read and from which I've learned a great deal. And this royal attire is associated with God's kingly presence within the sanctuary. The veil was embroidered with images of cherubim, which not only symbolize the presence of Israel's God, but also infers a prohibitive function. The cherubim first appear in the Hebrew Bible in Genesis chapter 3, where they guarded the way to the tree of life. And the veil's function was to separate the holy place from the Holy of Holies. This kind of structural separation, the Hebrew badal, had a cultic function as well. That is, the same language of separation that indicates the function of the veil is used throughout the priestly code of Leviticus for the distinction between unclean and clean animals, as well as in Ezekiel's temple vision for the distinction between the sacred and profane. Such separation between the holy and unholy, clean and unclean, sacred and profane is appropriate for the cultic context in which the veil appears. For within the Holy of Holies is where God himself is said to be present. That is, the primary function of the veil was to restrict physical access to the throne of God, and thus his very presence, which was a privilege granted only to consecrated priests on the Day of Atonement. The veil within Second Temple Judaism. When Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians in 587 BCE, the temple was destroyed but soon rebuilt by those returning from exile, beginning in 538 BCE. This structure is known as the Temple of Zerubbabel, governor of the period, and was completed around 515 BCE. Lacking the Solomonic temple's rich adornment, according to the prophet Haggai, Zerubbabel's temple was apparently damaged several times over the years and was ultimately rebuilt by Herod the Great. Herod's work on the temple began between 23 and 19 BCE and was completed with the exception of detailed additions and adornments within about 10 years. Additions were continually added to the structure right up to the outbreak of the Jewish revolt in 66 CE. It was largely patterned after Solomon's temple and, of course, likewise had a veil. Yet traditions within Second Temple Judaism pertaining to the temple veil are not as prevalent as one might expect, and vary from reflections upon the Solomonic temple itself to idealizations in the heavenly sanctuary, to physical descriptions of the Herodian veil, and legends about what happened to it upon the destruction of the Herodian temple by the Romans in 70 CE. So let's look at a few Second Temple texts before we look at some detailed descriptions, particularly by Josephus. In the book of Sirach, or the Wisdom of Ben Sira, we find mention of a priest coming out of the temple with a phrase in Hebrew, mabet leperket, which could be understood as from behind the veil, or as the Greek Septuagint translates it, from the house of the veil. The Hebrew word could be rendered either way. The Greek text seems to use the house of the veil as a circumlocution for the temple building, suggesting not only that the temple is to be identified with respect to its veil, but also an explicit indication that the veil stood in some sense for something beyond itself, meaning the temple as a whole. In 1 Maccabees, we read that the veil is among the objects of worship that Antiochus Epiphanes plundered from the Jerusalem shrine in his attempt at erasing the telltale signs of Jewish heritage in 1 Maccabees 1:22. Yet later we read in 1 Maccabees 4:51 that the veil is among the curtains rehung in a reconstituted Jerusalem temple. In the letter of Aristeas, the author purports to give an eyewitness account of an ambassadorial visit to Jerusalem, in which the author visits the temple and describes its veil billowing and flowing in the passing breeze, which made a pleasant and unforgettable spectacle, according to Aristeas 86. Another, and this one very strange occurrence of the veil, is found in a work called Joseph and Asenath, which purports to narrate events surrounding the biblical Joseph and his marriage to the Egyptian Asenath from Genesis 41. Here, Asenath, being an Egyptian, is converted to Judaism, and her conversion is depicted as the removal of a veil. And the language here is very specific and very unique in terms of using a term that is used only for this curtain. So her conversion is described as removing a veil from before a window. In this respect, the author uses a recognizable cultic image for its prohibitive function, whereby its removal is an indication of religious conversion. Another text called Lives of the Prophets contains a description of the curtain of the sanctuary, which is torn to pieces, which will be carried away by angels into the wilderness. The date of this is somewhat debated, and it certainly contains Christian interpolations. One text that is certainly Jewish and does not contain Christian interpolations is a Jewish apocalyptic text written shortly after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE called 2nd Baruch. 2nd Baruch describes the veil as among the cultic items taken out of the temple by angels just before its destruction by the Romans. We find a few references to the veil in the documents from Qumran among the Dead Sea Scrolls. The fragmentary account in the Temple Scroll says that the veil is made of gold, like other cultic vessels, and it may be used as part of a broader heavenly temple in Jerusalem envisioned for the future. In a liturgical work called the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice, the reader is led through the heavenly sanctuary, where the veil is seen with a luminous and fiery appearance. It is, in its lavish embroidery, this heavenly counterpart to the earthly veil bears images of cherubim, which are animated and participating in heavenly worship in song to God. I think we're to envision here something like Harry Potter. If you've seen the Harry Potter movies, when you get your Albus Dumbledore playing cards, they are animated and moving figures. And we get a picture of this with cherubim woven into the veil of the heavenly sanctuary, and these woven cherubim are actually engaging in cultic worship along with the reader. Philo of Alexandria describes the veil as being made of the same material, dyed with red and purple, scarlet and bright white, though the significance of his meaning is much debated. More helpful, I think, is the writing of Josephus, who provides considerable detail about the veil in the Herodian temple, which was among the items, he says, was delivered into the hands of the Romans after the temple is destroyed and is taken to Rome with its plunder. Josephus is very descriptive and specific. He says that the veil is, and here I'm quoting, of Babylonian tapestry with embroidery of blue and fine linen, of scarlet also and purple, wrought with marvelous skill, nor was it a mixture of material without its mystic meaning. It typified the universe, for the scarlet seemed emblematic of fire, the fine linen of the earth, the blue of the air, the purple of the sea, and the comparison of these two cases being suggested by their color, and in that the fine linen and purple by their origin, as the one is produced by the earth and the other by the sea. On this tapestry was portrayed a panorama of the heavens, the signs of the zodiac accepted. This depiction of especially Babylonian tapestry in scarlet, purple, and skill is depiction of royalty and rich in meaning. It is thought to depict this panorama of the heavens, which may suggest a comparison with the heavenly firmaments from Genesis 1:6. In other words, I think that in part what Josephus is describing when he says he's looking at the veil and this is what it looks like the sky. It suggests a firmament imagery and even a visual depiction of the heavens. We'll return to Josephus in a few moments, but first let's look at some early Christian tradition about the veil. The veil of the temple is hardly mentioned in earliest Christian writings. It is found in two contexts. One is in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where it is said that the curtain of the temple, and this is the same language for the inner veil, was torn in two from top to bottom. This suggests that at least part of the prohibitive function of the veil is removed. And the significance here is that it is torn from top to bottom, in that it is from heavenly origin that this veil is torn. In other words, God himself tore this veil in order to gain an access, most likely, to God himself. But the significance here in early Christian tradition is that this access is gained or is achieved by the death of Jesus. All of these accounts in all three synoptics occur right after the death of Jesus, suggesting to the readers that Jesus' death has initiated this unprecedented event. No other mention of the temple or its significance of this event is described in the synoptics. Instead, we look to the book of Hebrews, where the veil tradition is discussed in three locations. It is said that the believer's hope lies, quote, behind the veil in 6:19, within the Holy of Holies, where Christ himself offered himself as a sacrifice in 9:3, and is open for believers a new and living way to Israel's God. It's important here to note that for the author of Hebrews, this is still the Israel's God from the Hebrew Bible. What is distinct is the accessibility of Israel's God through what the author describes as the veil that is Christ's body in Hebrews 10:20. Discussions of the veil in subsequent early Christian literature is almost exclusively drawn from these accounts, and there's quite a variety of things that early Christian authors have to say about veil traditions pertaining to the tearing of the veil. Some of them say that it is a depiction of God's judgment against Jerusalem and Israel for its rejection of Jesus. Others indicate that it's a sign of mourning in the Hebrew Bible, when one was in extreme grief, one tore one's clothes. And so some of the depictions are that when Jesus died, the veil is torn, meaning God himself is rending his garments in grief. And there are many other kinds of images, including the removal of unbelief and so forth, that authors have used in their interpretation of this veil tradition. I'd like to move to a section that in which I conflate Jewish and Christian traditions as well as non-Jewish or Christian, or sometimes called pagan, or other traditions, where there are points of similarity. So I'm talking about Josephus, I'm talking about some rabbinic literature, I'm talking about Tacitus and so forth. Josephus lists wonders that occurred within the temple prior to its destruction. So the temple is destroyed in 70 CE. Josephus describes a number of miraculous things. Among them, he says that the enormous brass doors to the eastern gate of the inner court, which, according to him, could hardly be moved by 20 men, was seen opening by itself at midnight. The priests in the inner court, hearing a collective voice at Pentecost, saying, "We are departing from here." Tacitus, in his histories, concurs that there were bad omens prior to the fall of the temple, including armies fighting in heaven, opening of doors in the holy place, and the voice of the gods as they depart, and a lighting of the temple. Some rabbis, looking to Babylonian Talmud and Jerusalem Talmud, say that 40 years before the temple was destroyed, the doors that were closed in the evening were found open in the morning, an event which was interpreted by the rabbis as predicting its ultimate destruction. These are among a host of examples from antiquity where deities give extraordinary signs, typically at the death of noble figures, though not exclusively so, obviously. Another tradition recounts an episode involving the Roman general Titus. Titus is the one who ultimately leads the Roman assault on Jerusalem when the temple is destroyed. In one text, at least according to the rabbis, claim that upon his victory, Titus said, and I quote, "Where is their God, the rock in whom they trusted?" Then, quote, "The wicked Titus, who blasphemed and insulted heaven, committed two atrocities in the temple. First, according to this tradition, Titus took a harlot by the hand and entered the Holy of Holies and spread out a scroll of the law and committed a sin on it. After this, he is said to have taken a sword and slashed the veil. Miraculously, blood spurted out, and he thought that he had slain himself. Traditions, perhaps related to this account, say that following their victory over Jerusalem and plundering its temple, the veil ended up in Rome. We have no depictions of this on the Arch of Titus, of course. Rabbi Eleazar, son of Rabbi Joseph, who may date from the generation after Bar Kokhba, was said to have seen it in Rome, and there were on it several drops of blood. Some rabbis understood that blood sprinkled toward the veil on the Day of Atonement would sometimes touch the veil and render it unclean. What do you do with an unclean veil? Well, you cleanse it. How do you cleanse it? This is accomplished by a ceremonial immersion within the temple courts or perhaps outside, depending on the degree of uncleanness. According to tradition, this required 300 priests who descended into a ritual bath to dip the veil. After this, they would spread it out into the temple complex, and in some instances, spread it out for everyone to see its magnificence. The veil was often revered for its craftsmanship and cost. It is thought to be 1 handbreadth thick. It was woven of 72 threads, as Margaret had mentioned the other day. There were no knots in the thread, according to some traditions. It was said to be made by 82 young girls. There's some variation in this tradition who took their wages from temple funds. Some Christian accounts suggest the veil was woven by Mary as a child, according to Proto-Evangelium of James. who, when a needle accidentally pricked her finger, tradition says, was, quote, given a foretaste of the pain she would feel at the crucifixion. The veil has a very rich history in literary context of Judaism and Christianity. There's a great deal more information that we could cover. But what surprises me is that within the Second Temple Jewish context, with not traditions that relate to that setting, but texts that are demonstrably from that time period, there is remarkably little that is said. In Judaism, the initial concern is explicitly its preservation of the sanctity of the sanctuary and of Israel's God. That was its role. It's mentioned among identifiable cultic objects, defined dating both from the area of the Hasmoneans and the Romans. What's interesting is that even though the temple was long destroyed, the rabbis have preserved and developed traditions preserved to its sanctity and care. Also without a temple, the sectarians from Qumran, who project the veil into their conception of angelic worship within the heavenly sanctuary, have seen fit to preserve its important function. In earliest Christianity, the prohibitive function of the veil is severed precisely because of the sacrificial death of Christ. In Hebrews, the veil is Jesus' body through which the Christian passes to the presence of God. Yet it is intriguing, as I've mentioned before, that there's no indication here that the God of Israel is in any sense changed. What has changed is the believer's accessibility to God through the sacrifice of Jesus. And this can serve, I think, as simply an overview of the many complex traditions, often contrary traditions, that we find in Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity.
Well, I am honored to be in this company. The reason I am here is because I collect gamma marks from the Jewish and Christian context. BYU Studies has kindly offered to host my database on their website, part of which I will share today. If time permits, I will speculate on what these marks represent. Here, you see 4 gamma marks from the 6th century. This basilica nave has 3 registers. The top portrays events from Christ's life, the middle, Christian authors, and the bottom, saints progressing past angels toward Christ. Let's go here. Here you see the gamma marks. Martin didn't get any. And on the angels. Clearly the gamma marks are associated with a level of holiness. On the opposite wall, we see 22 virgin martyrs. They aren't all in this picture. And the Magi leading them past angels to Christ and Mary. They are all gamma bedecked. In the picture in this picture itself, I count 30 different gammas, 75 if you count the golden squares on Mary and on the women, the virgin martyrs. Let's go here. So here is Mary's, here is Christ's, and here are the angels. And just a little closer, you can see that Mary's mark is parallel to the mark of Christ in kind of a blurry close-up. Christ and the angels have golden, this is from the top layer. Christ and the angels have gammas on their robes, and Christ's is golden. Likewise, the scriptural authors have them. Notice the little teeth on the end, and back on this one also. You see these little denticulate ends, these little teeth on the ends of them. of them. Likewise, on the scriptural authors, here are the virgin martyrs. They have jeweled tiara, and they carry crowns, they wear veils, and they have robes over their left shoulders, which are marked 2 in the front, and it appears, oops, didn't do that right, and also hanging down the back, it appears we have these golden squares. On the south wall, we see a Pharisee and a sinner who have gone up to the temple to pray, and this is a portrayal of at least a veil of the temple, and it is also marked with that golden square, like Mary's. The earliest known instances of gamma marks are found in the Jewish context from the time of Herod's temple. This is a floor from the Jewish quarter, not too far from the Temple Mount, that shows 2 gammas, right here, see the denticulate ends, that fill in the space between a square and a circle, and this was destroyed at the time the temple was destroyed. These mosaics in Galilee from the Magdala synagogue, which Dr. Rensburg talked about, this is from the floor of the synagogue. They also are the rivals for the earliest gamma marks. Here we have the gammas in the corner. You can see the denticulate ends, and you can see again we have the square and then the circle, which was almost a sign of identity of this rosette of the Jewish people. And just off of this picture is that curious stone that Dr. Rensburg talked about. We have several reasons to believe that this synagogue was out of step with the cult at Jerusalem and may very well have been a synagogue where Christ preached in Galilee. Here is from a mixed Jewish town where Rabbi Judah worked on a floor, and we have our gamma mark here. A lot of questions about that one. This is a Jewish ossuary, and you see there are 8 gamma marks, and they have 3 little marks coming out of the end, and again framing 2 circles with the rosette inside. Textiles from Masada give the earliest evidence that gamma marks were worn during life. Purple gammas were woven into 3 different items of wool clothing found there. 63 years later, after Masada, many gamma-bedecked mantles were found left as the Bar Kokhba revolt ended. The sketch left shows the marks where the gammas appeared on the cloth, and again the very distinct denticulate ends. Some of the 160 marked woolen textiles from this period clearly come from the Jewish context, while others are ambiguous, such as the one found in the Roman fort just south of Hadrian's Wall. The right angle form, this guy here, is the commonest form on 67 of the ones where we can recognize the complete mark, with this, we'll call it an eta form or an H form, coming in next at only 25%. The best example of a textile with the eta marks is this Coptic, that's Egyptian Christian mantle, where the eta marks are in the same position. The Jewish and the Christian communities both used similarly marked mantles in the same time period. At Dura Europa, again, we have gamma marks, the traditional right angle shape only on the women. Here it's the infant Moses with his mother and sister. These blue marks on the mantle may be the ends of an eta shape or parts of a purposefully hidden right angle gamma. In this picture of the anointing of David, the only person who does not have gamma marks is David. Here he is. Possibly connecting the anointing and the right to wear the gamma marks. 3 men have their right arms, their hands raised, thumb extended, about at the level of their ears. 19 woolen fragments from a vestry at Dura Europos synagogue have gamma marks woven into white wool, an expensive and hard-to-maintain color. At Dura Europos synagogue, gammas were both portrayed on the exalted dead and worn by the living. This is a 5th century synagogue. We have Eta marks up here. There's 10 of them up here on the white-clad Jewish warriors. And then down here we have a line of sages, also white-clad. And we're going to look at this fellow in a close-up. He has the Eta shape at his knee, on both knees. We do not know whether he is an historic figure or an honored or revered leader of that particular synagogue. They haven't been able to identify it as a particular historic figure. The 8-pointed star appears frequently in the Christian context of the period, sometimes associated with Melchizedek. And here's our 8-pointed star. The 8-pointed star can be seen as 8 gammas in a circle. And Dr. Gaskell pointed that out also. Here it appears on the clasp of a 4-inch menorah medallion, perhaps meant to dress the Torah, as the high priest was dressed when he appeared before the Lord. The medallion, with its temple imagery, is said to represent the priest's breastplate. It would be strange if a purely Christian clasp were put on such a sacred item. So the 8-pointed star may have had meaning in the Jewish context also. Islam embraced the 8-pointed star shape as well. Our earliest Christian gammas come from the sands of Egypt and the catacombs of Rome. The tooth ends on these textiles from Egypt are capped, but they each frame an 8-point or a 16-point motif. Here's just a little section of this one, and the textile here is probably a mantle rather than a wall hanging. In the catacombs, show you where to look right here. Here's Christ. The gammas occur on scriptural figures and on recently departed saints. An Eta gamma right here. A standing youth, and Moses, the raising of Lazarus. And you'll see that there's a gamma on the front and the back showing of this mantle. Such a piece of clothing would have to be 8 feet long anyway to go over his shoulder and come down. And here we have a swastika shape, which could be 4 gammas in a row, rotating around a center. Here we have a gamma of some sort on the angel stopping Balaam and his steed, and we have Moses parting the Red Sea with a swastika shape. After the peace of the church under Constantine, if a prophet, patriarch, martyr, angel, or apostle is portrayed in a basilica, he or she is likely to be wearing a mantle with a gamma mark. By now, you know where to look. There are actually 8 in this image, but you can see them here, and here, and here, and here, and here, depending on how good your eyes are. Both Christ and angels in this wear gamma marks. And again, you'll see those little denticulate ends here. Here's the Christ child up close so you can see his gamma mark. Mary and Elizabeth, carrying John and Christ, both have marks on the end of their robes, as does the Christ child, but not John. But Saints Peter and Paul do. This is all from 440. Note the long teeth on Lot's gamma. This is from the same place. Here. This mosaic is a little shy of 1,600 years old. From Croatia, the hand of God, crowns, angels. Oops. Back one. What did I do? Well, this is a mosaic floor in Jordan. There's a woman praying. Your hands up like this is the mark of prayer, and this is a close-up of the marks here near the bottom of her robe, and here they are, swastika shape. And here we have the hand. Oops, not very good with this, am I? Here we have a crown, the hand of God, more crowns, and gamma marks on angels and on men. Do you spot the gamma marks surrounding the crosses on these books? Once you start to look for them, back in Ravenna, where we started with the first slides that showed the saints and the Virgin Martyrs processing past Christ, this is from the Arian baptistry. It was one of several such buildings where adults were baptized by torchlight on Holy Saturday, Easter Eve, and clad in white clothes. The next morning, they would go to a special Mass, and for the next 8 days, they would receive instruction and process forward under those Virgin Martyrs before they were allowed to approach the Eucharist table. So 8 days later, they would have the sacrament. Other sacred textiles also are portrayed with gamma marks. The gammas on the vela, not very good at that, of the veils, enclose our golden squares again. Since the hand of God comes down from behind the vela, we can assume that they represent the margin between eternity and this life, as they did in the Jerusalem temples. Melchizedek presides over a sacrifice table, and there are 8 gammas here, framing our 8-pointed star and framing the Eucharist. The Lives of the Pope in the 9th century mentions gamma marks on altar cloths surrounding crosses. Another one, this one has the addition of gamma marks down here on the bottom of the altar. The table of the Last Supper is treated as an altar with gamma marks and the square again. The male saints on the first slide process through these vela here with the gamma marks surrounding squares into the nave and then past Christ, past the angels toward Christ from the first pictures. Ravenna is on the outside of the veils, out here. The gammas on the large of the, well, you saw those. This is a closer up of it. You can see, I think you can see without me pointing. When the great era of church building waned, gammas became less prominent, but continued to be included on sacred mosaics and on sacred clothing, especially in the Middle East, especially in the East. These portraits of early bishops were made in the late Middle Ages. Can you spot the gamma marks? Here, and here, and he has both kinds here around the outside of the cross, and then a cross made out of gamma marks. These are gammas on an iconostasis, the modern-day analog of the veil of the temple, from an Orthodox church in Athens. Conclusions. These images suggest gamma marks are ancient, at least the time of Herod's temple. Used simultaneously by Jews and Christians, used by women and men during life and in death, shown on prophets, patriarchs, saints, angels, and on Christ. They are connected to the anointing. They are shown on the honored dead and are worn by the living concurrently. They're used on many textiles that define sacred spaces. They are persistent, relatively unchanging, evidently symbolic, and evocative. They've been called sepulchral symbols, astral symbols, right-angle strips, hook-shaped signs, keys to heaven's door, and heaven's keys. They have been identified as a simplified representation of a hand, presumably with the thumb extended, the water of life, the convergence of 2 stone walls at a right angle, a building corner, a gamma, as in the Greek letter, and a gam, or a gammadion. But that didn't come up until the 9th century. That name has very little. What do they mean? I'd give a dime to know. I lean toward 2 meanings, the right angle building corner and a key, as in the key in Isaiah. I will clothe him with thy robe, strengthen him with thy girdle, and the key of the house of David will I lay upon his shoulder, and he shall open, and none shall shut, and he shall shut, and none shall open. Those are keys from Bar Kokhba, but that's for another time.
am not here to present. I'm Jim Burklow, Associate Dean of Religious Life here on our campus, and we're helping host this event. And I'm just delighted to be here and to learn. This is just absolutely fascinating. Thank you, all three. That was really, really engaging and interesting. And I just, what I want to do is just reflect back and ask some questions, really. Throw some stuff out there that I hope we can discuss together with all of you on the panel. So some observations. One is a question, really. I'm interested in how what happened before the building of the temple by the Jewish people, the time of the Ark, and the whole concept of a portable sacred space, how that moved into the permanent space of the temple, and how what preceded the temple might have followed it. How the whole concept of a portable sacred space, the Ark of the Covenant moving through the desert, how that carried on into the life of the synagogue after the destruction of the temple in 70 A.D. And I don't know anything about this, but I'd like to know. That's a question that came up for me. Another thing I'm really curious about exploring with our scholars is Christian cosmology as it relates to the tearing of the veil. Because what we find in the New Testament is, and other early Christian writing, is evidence that the early Christians believed that the death and resurrection of the Christ was a cosmic event. It had cosmic significance, and that what was happening in that event was an alteration, a cataclysmic alteration of the order of the cosmos. So we had the seven heavens, the seven spheres, crystal spheres of the Ptolemaic universe, or the three heavens, a different arrangement according to St. Paul, but the same idea. So you have these concentric levels of the planets and their spheres representing different orders of closeness to ultimate divine purity and perfection. And what you have in the Christ event is the breaking through all of those spheres for direct rule of God on the earth through the Christ. So it was a reordering of the cosmos in early Christianity. And I am really curious about how that relates to the tearing of the veil and the meaning of that incident in the gospel story of the crucifixion. The significance of that. So the significance of the veil, and the tearing of the veil itself in early Christian cosmology. I'd love to hear more about that. Fascinated by these gamma marks. Boy, I think you left with definitely with more questions than any answers on that. It's like marks that are just there, and what are they about? They must mean something. That was very intriguing. So just to get this group to speculate about the meaning of those marks and similar iconography relating to sacred space. Yeah, these are the questions that I take away. And just the idea of the portability, again, and this idea that the angels took the veil from the temple. I love that image, that they swept it up before the destruction of the temple. And but that also evokes a sense of portability of sacred space. I think of I can only think of the story of Naaman as I listen to this. You know, Naaman is cured of his disease by his leprosy by Elijah, and then he wants to take the power of God from the land of Israel, where Yahweh, who healed him, holds sway. He wants that power to go with him, and so he takes a load of dirt from Israel, puts it on a cart, and carts it off to his homeland of Syria so that he will have access to Yahweh. So there's a certain kind of henotheism here, you know, the locality, the localization of the divine in the land of Israel. And I just wonder how that the henotheism, how that relates to this whole concept of sacred space, sacred location, and the portability, the potential for portability and movability of that space. It seems to me, in listening about the gamma marks, that they create an enclosure. Yes, there's a sense of creating a space. They mark a space. They mark a region of the sacred, and I think that's sort of a theme that goes through this discussion. So that's me asking questions. Can't wait to hear yours. Let's talk. Yes? And I'll bring the mic over and we will mix it up.
We've had a lot to think about. We've had clear presentations of material that is more or less widely known, and I think I can say all of us, those gamma marks are a complete revelation. They are quite extraordinary. But this is one of the nice things about doing temple stuff, because you never know what's going to turn up next. Those gamma marks in Ravenna have been there for 1,500 years, and Jan has asked the questions. Well, good for her. Now, we had some interesting questions from Jim, our respondent. What was there before the fixed temple, and what after? Now, Gary, would you like to say something about, the before and the after?
Thank you. Well, obviously, the earliest documentation we have from the Torah is the existence of the portable sanctuary. God commands Moses to construct it with great detail at the end of the book of Exodus. And we've been hearing about many of those details the last 2 days. And then it's constructed, and it serves as the sanctuary for the people of Israel as they wander through the desert and even as they come into the land of Israel. If we date the time of Moses to about 1200 BCE and Solomon's construction of the temple to about 960 BCE, that means for about 2.5 centuries the tabernacle would have existed. It eventually finds a permanent home in Shiloh, a village maybe 15 kilometers north of Jerusalem. And then eventually parts of it, or at least the ark for sure, is conveyed to Jerusalem in a ceremony by King David, and then Solomon builds the temple. The connection between the two, and I actually now want to add something that I'll take the opportunity to add something which I neglected to say in my remarks. Both the tabernacle and the temple have the same status of sacredness, of sacrality. They are both equally sacred, which in the biblical tradition means that one can enter them only in a state of ritual purity. And the book of Leviticus, in chapters 11 through 15, lays out those items or those states which turn you into a state of impurity, to which we then add Numbers chapter 19. And those include various skin diseases, childbirth, what we call genital flows, vaginal blood for women, semen for men, and in Numbers 19, the most serious type of impurity, that of corpse impurity, contact with the dead. So you could not enter either the tabernacle or the temple, and these laws would have applied for both the first and second temple. So this would have been a 1200 or 1300 year tradition in ancient Israel and early Judaism. The point I neglected to mention is the synagogue carries none of that. So when the sacred space of the temple is lost, and yes, there are replacements for it in memory, in art, in architecture, in ritual, etc., as I showed, or hopefully have demonstrated, the synagogue does not include that sanctity. There is no sacredness to the synagogue, which is to say, people in a state of impurity, menstruant women, people who have contacted the dead, and so on, may enter the synagogue. So I just want to make that very clear. I think Reuven Firestone alluded to some of this yesterday in his remarks as well. And so he was talking about there's no consecration of a synagogue like you would have in various Christian traditions. So I'm not sure I answered the question, but I did want to take the opportunity to sort of give you the broad, to use the French term, la longue durée, the entire duration of tabernacle, temple, and eventually post-temple synagogue ritual space, but only the first two actually have the sacredness attached to them, where the synagogue does not. That doesn't mean that one can, one should obviously act in a sense of decorum in a synagogue, and one shouldn't go in there doing unseemly acts. But it doesn't have the sacredness of the temple or the tabernacle which preceded it, which in the biblical tradition is based on these purity and impurity laws.
You know, there's two traditions. One is that there was one temple. There was one tabernacle. There was one temple. And nowhere else was sacred. But there's a great deal of evidence that there were other sacred places, that there were other temples. And the Mormon tradition is that Israelites left Jerusalem, and 3 days out they built an altar and prayed, and they came to a new continent and built a temple, and like Solomon's, but not so grand. So we sort of weigh in on the theory that there were many sacred places and that the Jerusalem temple was perhaps preeminent, but it wasn't alone. And that, I think, makes a difference when you think about the sacred place.
Right, Daniel. Yes? Well, yes, we have. I have just been given permission to go on to 25 parts.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. Well, with that, I wanted to sort of return to this question about what do we do with sacred space when the temple is destroyed. The synagogue is not the sacred space, at least not in the same sense. But then the question comes to my mind about what do Jews conceive of, or at least some Jews conceive of, with respect to sacred space. If that sacred space isn't there and the synagogue isn't the sacred space, does that mean there's no more sacred space? And different groups had different ways of appropriating that. If we go back to Second Baruch is the one that preserves that tradition that the angels came and took some of these sacred articles and kept them. And the notion is that they were kept safe, not so much for their portability as much as to remove them from a place where they would be defiled by the coming of the Romans, with the anticipation of a reconstituted temple. So the notion that at one point God is going to establish his earthly reign and come and reconstitute a temple in Jerusalem to replace the one that's been destroyed. In some traditions, it's quite dramatic, dating from the 2nd century BCE. The Psalms of Solomon depict the coming of a messianic son of David who's going to come and violently purge the impious from the Eretz Israel and establish pure and right sacrifices. In some, it's anticipation of an eschatological or heavenly sanctuary without much conception of a reconstituted temple. So there are a variety of ways that Jews in the Second Temple period appropriated this notion of the sacred space with no longer having the physical access to the temple.
Can I just add one very quick comment to that? While the temple was standing, and several people I believe have mentioned this, the Essene community at Qumran removed itself from the temple with all of the disagreements amongst the various Jewish sects as to how temple rituals should be conducted. One of the solutions was just to remove yourself from it. They were extremely priestly. They were extremely temple-orientated. The longest scroll from Qumran is called the Temple Scroll, which Daniel referred to, and yet they removed themselves from the entire temple. In a brilliant piece of exegesis, one of the fragmentary scrolls from Qumran actually refers to their community as Mikdash Adam, a sanctuary of humanity, right? So that the congregation itself becomes the holiness is found in that community.
In both the Jewish and the Mormon tradition, I think there's a real effort to make the home a sacred space also.
Now, we've got various things we can do in the precious 10 minutes left. We have just handed in a very, very interesting comment, and I think this is for you, Jan. Regarding the gamma and eta marks, is there possibly significance in the fact that these are the 3rd and 7th letters, and they would also have doubled as those numerals, the 3rd and 7th letters of the Greek alphabet? 3 and 7 are theologically significant numbers in the Bible. What do you think about that as a suggestion?
Well, I'd give a dime to know, but the first...
You're running up a bill.
The first time we... May I have the mic? Yes. The first time we have record of them being called gamma marks are in the 9th century, actually the last 4 or 5 days of the 4 or 5 years of the 8th century. They are used in the lives of the popes over a period of 63 years for a couple of architectural elements and then mostly for vestes and vela, altar cloths and veils, and then with one exception, they disappear from the record. So it's 800 years anyway after these marks appear in the Hebrew connection, first the Jewish connection, and then the early Christian church. And that name does not appear again in print until we get ecclesiastical dictionaries in the 17th century, I believe. So I think by naming them after a letter, we put a fog screen in front of ourselves. I wouldn't be surprised if that's true, because symbols have a way of picking up meaning, but I wouldn't look for those as the primal source of meaning for it. If I were looking for a letter, I would have to look for a Hebrew letter, I think, unless everybody's on the Septuagint and is doing, I mean, a letter form, I think, is a red herring. And it's one of the reasons I didn't name them. I showed you pictures of them, because once you name them, you close your mind to the possibilities of what they might be. So,
was gematria done in the Greek alphabet? Does anybody know about that?
I think so.
The Lives of the Pope was in Latin, and by the 9th century, Latin was a pretty rare language in the Roman tradition. We don't know what the absence of proof, but we don't have. Oh yes, later into the second millennium. A matter of fact, in the roof of the chapel in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, there is Peter and Paul, and they both have monograms, kind of like Laverne and Shirley. They have P's on their robes. So clearly, whatever their original meaning was, they did transfer into Latin letters toward the end of the first millennium of the Common Era. And then, somewhere along the line, someone decided they were letters, and we don't read Greek anymore, and let's use Latin letters. But that probably isn't true in the first 6 centuries that we have.
Right. Now, this is another of Jim's questions, and I think this one possibly is for you, Daniel. The cosmic event of tearing the temple veil and the implication of no intermediaries. Would you like to comment? That's a very theological one.
Thank you. Yes, the question of the tearing of the veil in the role of an intermediary. I think if we're conflating a couple different notions here. One is from the Synoptic tradition, and one is from the book of Hebrews. And I think the one in the book of Hebrews is mostly what's in mind when we're talking about an intermediary, because what happens is that the veil is depicted as Jesus' body, and so the believer enters into a heavenly sanctuary, which is a metaphor for salvation, and ultimately entering into an eschatological presence of God. And the means by which that is accomplished is through Jesus' body. But in Hebrews, Jesus' body is the veil. Jesus is the priest who offers the sacrifice, and Jesus himself is the sacrifice. So, and in Hebrews also, the author presents Jesus as an intercessor. So, in a sense, the notion of it no longer needing an intercessor is a little bit different because there is an intercessor in the notion of Hebrews, but that intercessor is no longer a human priest. And the indication in Hebrews is in looking at the sacrificial system through the book of Leviticus, there are a number of incompletions that the author of Hebrews points out in the Hebrew Bible that he's intending to illustrate for the reader's show that there's an insufficiency, there's an incompleteness about the system. There's frailty of the priest that is himself incomplete, and he's making sacrifices for himself. So there is this notion that Jesus is the new intercessor. He is the priest, and he is the sacrifice. So it doesn't do away with those things as much as it finds those things culminated in the person and the activities, the sacrificial, self-sacrificial activities of Jesus.
Right. Well, as we have 3 minutes left, I'm going to ask a question. Gary, about the Magdala stone, which really is hot news, isn't it? I mean, it's quite amazing. And it is reckoned that that was made when the temple was still standing. Is that the consensus? Right. Now, I'm intrigued at the way they depict the menorah. It's the way I would expect the menorah to be drawn. But it's completely different from the way it's depicted in the Dura fresco. So, how reliable is the evidence for the temple in the Dura fresco?
Did you just ask how reliable is the depiction of the temple or the menorah specifically? I will just punt the question to Stephen Fine. His book, 500, 600-page book on the menorah in art and architecture will be out sometime within a month or so. So we can look forward to all the answers from him. I suspect, I don't know if he was able to include an appendix on the Magdala stone recent discovery. I will say the following. The Dora is already at a distance of a few centuries. All of these depictions do not cohere with one another, and I assume that's what Stephen Fine is going to talk about. But the two that are in theory, three in theory, are contemporary with the first century. There's the Magdala one, the depiction on the Arch of Titus, and one that I did not show, and probably the least that you may not know about, in one of the rooms that Janet showed, one of the houses that Janet showed in the Jewish quarter just outside the temple, where we have beautiful priestly homes from the Herodian period. We also have a depiction of menorah etched into one of the walls of that home. And the three, to the best of my knowledge, do not cohere with one another. The shape of the arms, the base, I mean, all of those little depictions are all slightly different. So the Dora one would, my answer would be probably not so reliable, especially when one begins to see all the other ones in such variety.
Well, it remains for me to thank our speakers, Daniel and Jim and Gary and Jan, and I'm sure you will join me in expressing your appreciation.